The warm glow of the terminal lights washed over the sleek glass walls of Los Angeles International Airport as travelers shuffled toward their gates, their rolling suitcases humming across polished floors. The air buzzed with a mix of anticipation and fatigue, the unique energy of people heading somewhere far away. Among them, unnoticed by most, walked Keanu Reeves. He moved with the quiet ease of a man who carried no need to be seen. Dressed in dark jeans, a simple black jacket, and scuffed boots, he blended seamlessly into the crowd. No entourage, no flashy luggage, no air of Hollywood grandeur. Just a calm, thoughtful man holding a worn leather bag slung over his shoulder. Few who passed him would suspect this was one of the most recognizable actors in the world, the man who had lived as Neo in The Matrix and John Wick in 100 gunfights. Tonight, he was just another traveler boarding a flight to New York. First-class passengers were already lining up, eager to escape the bustle of the terminal and sink into luxury. A tall, broad-shouldered man in a navy blue tailored suit pushed his way to the front. His wrist gleamed with the silver shine of a Rolex, and his cologne trailed behind him like a storm. His name was Richard Langston, a corporate executive whose fortune had been built on oil investments. Richard was the kind of man who measured his worth by how quickly others noticed him, and tonight he was irritated by how slowly the staff at the gate recognized his self-importance. He flashed his ticket impatiently, sighed loudly, and made a show of checking his expensive phone. He wanted everyone to know he belonged in first class, that the world was arranged to suit men like him. Keanu stood quietly in the same line, a few steps behind Richard. He offered a polite nod to the flight attendant as she scanned his ticket, murmured a soft, "Thank you," and moved down the jet bridge without fanfare. Richard glanced over his shoulder at him, frowning. To Richard, Keanu's modest attire and weathered bag screamed, "Coach passenger." He muttered something under his breath, loud enough for others to hear. Must have upgraded with points. Unbelievable who they let in first class these days. A couple of passengers looked at Keanu, then back at Richard, sensing the tension. Keanu said nothing. His expression, as always, was unreadable, serene, like a lake untouched by wind. The cabin of the plane sparkled with muted elegance. Plush leather seats reclined into beds, glasses of champagne glistened on polished trays, and soft lighting washed the space in a golden hue. Keanu settled into a window seat, setting his bag neatly at his feet. He gazed out at the runway, the blinking red and white lights of other planes moving like constellations in motion. For him, flights were a time of quiet reflection, a small pocket of stillness between the noise of life. He took out a paperback novel, its spine cracked and pages worn from travel. He opened it, ignoring the bustle of boarding around him. Richard strutted down the aisle behind him, pausing when he saw where Keanu had chosen to sit. His lips twisted into a smirk. Figures. They let anybody in here these days. He tossed his designer briefcase into the overhead bin with a thud and dropped into the seat directly across from Keanu. His voice carried, deliberately loud enough for surrounding passengers to hear. First class used to mean something. Now it's just diluted. The words dripped with contempt, and his eyes flicked toward Keanu as though to brand him as the target. Keanu looked up from his book, his face calm, his eyes soft. For a second, their gazes met, one pair burning with arrogance, the other radiating a quiet patience. Keanu said nothing, only offered the faintest nod, then returned to his page. To him, words spoken in bitterness didn't require an answer. But Richard wasn't finished. He leaned back in his seat, adjusting his tie theatrically, and scoffed, "I paid for this seat. Some of us actually earned our place here." Around them, the cabin had grown hushed. A young mother rocking her baby glanced nervously at the confrontation. A couple in their 50s exchanged uneasy glances. The flight attendants moved more swiftly, their professional smiles tight as they prepared the cabin for takeoff. They knew this type, men who believed money excused cruelty. They also knew the quiet man by the window was not just anyone, though they respected his preference to remain unnoticed. Keanu turned another page in his book, unruffled, as though the words meant for him had simply floated away, harmless as smoke. Yet there was something in his stillness that unsettled Richard. He wanted a reaction. He wanted the satisfaction of superiority. But instead of anger, he met only silence. And in that silence, a strange tension grew, like the hum of engines before takeoff, subtle but undeniable. The stage was set. Richard had no idea that the man he mocked was not only far greater than he imagined, but someone whose very presence on this flight would soon expose the hollowness of arrogance. For now, though, Keanu simply read, the golden glow of the cabin light falling across his page, as if nothing in the world could disturb his peace. The seatbelt sign chimed, and the cabin crew moved gracefully through the aisles, securing bins, checking belts, and offering warm smiles to passengers. The hum of the engines deepened as the plane taxied toward the runway, and the golden light outside dimmed into the velvety black of night. The atmosphere in first class should have been one of quiet luxury. Champagne glasses clinking, murmured conversations drifting between the soft hiss of air vents. But Richard Langston wasn't ready to let his irritation go. He leaned back in his plush seat, his voice pitched deliberately loud, the kind of voice that demanded attention even from those trying their best to ignore him. "You know," Richard said, addressing no one and yet everyone, "I worked 30 years to afford this lifestyle. 30 years of deals, negotiations, and late nights. And I look around and see people who, let's just say, don't look like they belong here." His eyes flicked pointedly at Keanu, still sitting quietly by the window, absorbed in his book. "Makes you wonder what the airlines come to. Used to be, you could tell who the real successes were. No, who knows?" A few passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. A young businessman too rose ahead, raised his eyebrows, but kept his mouth shut. No one wanted to invite conflict in such close quarters. The mother rocking her infant pulled the blanket tighter around her child, hoping to shield her from the tension radiating across the cabin. But Richard thrived on this discomfort. It fed him like applause at a performance. He wanted an audience, and most of all, he wanted a reaction from the man across the aisle. Keanu, however, remained as immovable as stone. He turned a page of his book, his fingers steady, his eyes calm. If he heard the words, and surely he had, he gave no sign. There was no flinch, no defensive posture, no irritation in his expression. To him, Richard's words were just another sound in the cabin, no more significant than the faint whir of the air system. His silence was not weakness, but strength, a refusal to play the part Richard had scripted for him. This silence only sharpened Richard's barbs. He chuckled to himself, shaking his head as if to share a private joke with the cabin. "I mean, look at him," he said, gesturing openly toward Keanu. "Jeans and a ratty jacket. Please. First class is about presentation. About class. You don't just buy a ticket. You represent success. Some of us built something. Others." He trailed off with a smirk, letting the implication dangle in the air. The flight attendant nearest them stiffened but kept her professional composure. She knelt slightly by Richard's seat, her voice soft but firm. "Sir, would you like some champagne?" she asked, redirecting his energy with practiced grace. Richard waved her off with exaggerated annoyance. "Not unless you've got a refill strong enough to make me forget the company I'm forced to keep tonight." He laughed loudly, clearly satisfied with his performance. Keanu finally looked up, not in anger, but in an almost tender patience. His eyes, deep and quiet, met Richard's across the aisle. "Sometimes," he said softly, his voice carrying just enough to be heard, "appearances don't tell the whole story." Then he lowered his gaze and returned to his book, as though nothing more needed to be said. The words hung in the air like a subtle challenge, not sharp or aggressive, but undeniably firm. A ripple passed through the cabin. The young mother's lips curved into the faintest smile. The couple across the aisle exchanged a glance of recognition. They knew who this quiet man was now. And Richard, for all his bluster, suddenly felt an irritation he couldn't name. The calmness unnerved him. He wanted Keanu rattled, wanted to see him stumble, but the man refused to bend. Richard leaned forward in his seat, lowering his voice into a mocking tone meant to cut deeper. "Appearances may not tell the whole story, but they tell enough. You can't fake class. You can't fake success. Some of us worked to get here. Others just lucked out." He sneered, waiting for Keanu to break, to defend himself. But Keanu didn't. He simply closed his book for a moment, resting it in his lap, and looked out the window. Outside, the night had swallowed the runway lights, and the stars shimmered faintly against the black canvas of the sky. He watched quietly, as though the world outside the glass was far more worthy of his attention than the insults inside the cabin. To him, Richard's words were nothing but noise, A man so desperate to be seen that he couldn't understand the power of being invisible. The engines roared as the plane lifted off the ground, carrying its passengers into the night. Inside, tension lingered like static electricity. Richard sat back with a smug grin, convinced he'd won some invisible battle. But around him, the cabin had shifted. Passengers were no longer impressed by his bravado. They were quietly gravitating toward the man by the window who met cruelty with grace. And though Richard couldn't see it, the balance of respect in that cabin had already tipped. The flight had only just begun, and already the cracks in Richard's arrogance were beginning to show. He didn't know it yet, but the very man he mocked would soon be the one to show him a truth he could never have imagined. A truth that would turn smug laughter into trembling regret. The plane had been in the air for over an hour, slicing smoothly through the night sky above the eastern United States. The first-class cabin had settled into a rhythm of quiet comfort. Soft lamps glowed above each seat, champagne flutes clinked gently, and the steady hum of the engines lulled most passengers into calm. Keanu sat still by the window, the book now closed in his lap. He gazed at the horizon, where moonlight spread across a blanket of clouds like silver spilled across velvet. He seemed at peace, even in silence, as if the sky itself offered him more company than the people around him. Richard, meanwhile, had not found peace. He had ordered 2 glasses of champagne in quick succession, leaning back in his seat with exaggerated relaxation, though his eyes kept flicking toward Keanu. Every time he saw the man's calm composure, something inside him bristled. He had insulted him, mocked him, tried to provoke him, yet still nothing. Keanu hadn't cracked, hadn't fought back, hadn't even seemed offended. To Richard, this was more infuriating than if the man had shouted at him. It made him feel invisible, and invisibility was the one thing Richard Langston couldn't bear. Then, without warning, the calm of the night broke. The plane shuddered as turbulence struck, the sudden drop jolting glasses and sending a few passengers gasping in alarm. The overhead bins rattled. The lights flickered. A baby cried out, piercing the cabin's hush. The seatbelt sign chimed again, sharp and insistent, as the captain's voice crackled overhead. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are experiencing some unexpected weather. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. Flight attendants, secure the cabin." The turbulence deepened, the aircraft rocking as though it were a toy boat tossed on an angry sea. Trays shook, drinks spilled, and passengers gripped their armrests with white-knuckled hands. The confident laughter and idle chatter that had once filled first class evaporated into anxious silence, broken only by nervous breaths and whispered prayers. Richard's arrogance shattered instantly. His face drained of color as the plane dropped again, a sudden dip that left stomachs lurching. He clutched his armrests, eyes wide, panic flashing across his features. The bravado was gone. What remained was a man stripped of his armor, as fragile as any other. "Oh God," he muttered under his breath, his voice shaking. "Oh God, not like this." Keanu, however, sat steady. He pressed a calming hand against the armrest, then leaned slightly across the aisle. His voice was soft but steady, a voice that carried reassurance even amid chaos. "It's okay," he said to the young mother holding her crying child. "These planes are built for storms. You'll be all right." His calm presence seemed to anchor her, and though her hand still trembled, her breathing slowed as she rocked the baby. Another jolt shook the cabin, and Richard let out a sharp gasp, his polished image crumbling further. His hand reached instinctively toward the flight attendant walking briskly down the aisle, his voice rising in panic. "Do something. Can't you do something?" The attendant, struggling to keep her balance, forced a calm smile. "Sir, please remain seated. This is normal turbulence." "Normal," Richard barked, his voice trembling. "Normal doesn't feel like the plane's about to tear apart. This is unacceptable. I didn't pay for this." His words cracked with fear, no longer the cutting arrogance of before, but the desperate whining of a man facing a truth he couldn't control. Keanu turned his head, watching Richard with quiet eyes. Not judgmental, not mocking, simply observing, as if seeing through the man's fear to something deeper. He didn't say anything to Richard at first. Instead, he turned his attention to an older woman seated nearby, who was clutching the armrest so tightly her knuckles had turned white. "Breathe with me," Keanu said gently. "In and out. Focus on that, not the shaking. Just breathe." His calm cadence worked like medicine. The woman's trembling lessened as she followed his lead. Around the cabin, others noticed. A quiet ripple of reassurance spread, not because the turbulence had stopped. It hadn't, but because one man's composure reminded them that fear didn't have to rule them. In that moment, Keanu Reeves was not a movie star. He was a steady presence, the kind of person who brought peace where panic threatened to take over. Richard, breathing heavily, stared at him. He hated what he saw, not because it was wrong, but because it was right. He saw the respect in the eyes of the passengers around them. He saw how Keanu's calm presence shifted the mood of the cabin. And for the first time, Richard realized something he'd never admit out loud. His wealth, his power, his suits and Rolex and arrogance, none of it mattered here, 30,000 feet above the ground, tossed about by forces beyond his control. What mattered was strength of character, the kind that couldn't be bought. And in that, Richard was bankrupt. The turbulence began to ease, the violent shaking softening into a gentle sway. The captain's voice returned over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've passed through the worst of the weather. Please remain seated until the seatbelt sign is off." A collective sigh of relief swept through the cabin, followed by nervous laughter and the clinking of glasses being reset. The baby quieted, the older woman loosened her grip, and passengers exchanged grateful glances. Keanu opened his book again, as though nothing had happened. Richard slumped in his seat, sweat beading his forehead, his earlier arrogance silenced for now. He looked at Keanu, his lips pressed tightly together, but the words he wanted to say caught in his throat. The storm outside had passed, but another storm, one inside Richard, was only just beginning. He had seen the cracks in his own facade, and though he tried to rebuild it, shame seeped through. The rest of the flight loomed ahead, and Richard knew he couldn't avoid the truth forever. The man he had mocked, dismissed, and ridiculed had just demonstrated a strength he could never fake. And soon, the truth about who Keanu really was, and why he was there, would bring Richard's pride crashing down for good. The worst of the turbulence had passed, leaving the aircraft gliding steadily once more through the quiet night sky. The cabin lights glowed softly, casting a golden warmth over faces that only minutes before had been etched with fear. Relief hummed through first class. Conversation started again in hushed tones, champagne flutes were refilled, and passengers exchanged small smiles of survival. Yet one seat remained steeped in unease, Richard's. He sat stiffly, the tremor in his hands betraying the fear that still clung to him. The arrogance he had carried onto the plane seemed hollow now, the armor cracked. His expensive suit looked no different than before, his Rolex still gleamed on his wrist, but something about him seemed smaller. Across the aisle, Keanu turned another page of his book, the same quiet presence as before, as if the storm had never rattled him. For him, turbulence was a fact of life, both in the sky and on the ground. He had weathered far worse storms than this one, storms of grief, loss, and loneliness. He didn't need to broadcast his calm, it radiated naturally. Passengers stole glances at him, whispers traveling in low tones. "That's Keanu Reeves, isn't it?" "I think it is. He's even calmer in real life than in the movies." The recognition spread slowly, respectfully, and with it came an undercurrent of admiration. The flight attendants, now free to move again, made their rounds, checking on passengers. One young attendant paused by Keanu's seat, her voice lowered with gratitude. "Mr. Reeves," she said softly, though enough ears caught it for the words to ripple outward, "I just wanted to say thank you. Not just for tonight, but for your generosity to the airline. Because of your donation, we were able to run our community program this year. The one that gave discounted or free flights to families in need." She smiled warmly, her voice carrying sincerity rather than performance. "You've helped so many people reunite with loved ones. Some of them are even on this flight." The words landed in the cabin like a spark in dry grass, quiet but undeniable. Heads turned. Murmurs spread. Richard's eyes widened, his stomach tightening. The passengers who had sat in awe of Keanu's calm during the storm now looked at him with a deeper reverence. This wasn't just an actor, not just a man who kept his cool. He was someone who used his influence and wealth for others, quietly, without cameras, without announcements. The young mother with a baby, who had been comforted by Keanu's words only minutes ago, leaned across the aisle. Her eyes shone with emotion. I think we might be here because of you," she said softly. "My husband lost his job last year. We couldn't afford tickets to visit my parents on the East Coast. But when the airline called with that program, I couldn't believe it. They said donors made it possible. She smiled through tears, holding her child closer. If that was you, thank you. Truly. Keanu shifted slightly, almost embarrassed by the attention. He gave her a small nod, his voice quiet, humble. I'm glad you could be here, he said simply. No speeches, no grand gestures, just sincerity. That was enough. For Richard, however, the walls of arrogance closed in. His mind reeled. He had mocked this man, dismissed him as someone unworthy of first class, someone who didn't belong. He had pointed his finger, sneered at his appearance, demanded recognition for his own wealth. And now, piece by piece, the truth revealed itself. This wasn't just a movie star. This wasn't just a man who sat quietly by a window. This was Keanu Reeves, the man who had survived tragedy, who had chosen kindness over bitterness, who had quietly funded strangers' happiness while men like Richard flaunted wealth for admiration. Richard's throat tightened. His earlier words replayed in his mind, each one a blade of shame cutting deeper. They let anybody in here these days. Some of us actually earned our place. You can't fake success. How hollow, how pathetic they sounded now. The weight of his arrogance pressed on him, heavier than any turbulence. The cabin felt different, too. Where before Richard's booming voice had dominated the space, now it was Keanu's quiet humility that held everyone's respect. Passengers leaned toward him with gratitude, not fawning celebrity worship, but genuine appreciation for the man behind the fame. A little boy from Coach peeked through the curtain, eyes wide as he whispered, "Mom, that's Neo." His mother smiled sheepishly, tugging him back, but Keanu raised a hand in a gentle wave, his face lighting with kindness. The boy grinned as though he'd just glimpsed a hero, which, in truth, he had. Richard shrank in his seat, his palms clammy. He wanted to speak, to apologize, but his pride wrestled with his shame. The words caught in his throat, clumsy and awkward. For a man who had built his life on commanding boardrooms, on speaking with authority, he now found himself speechless before the quiet dignity of another. He realized, perhaps for the first time, that true respect was not demanded, it was earned. And no amount of money, no tailored suit, no Rolex could buy the kind of respect this man commanded simply by being who he was. The aircraft continued its smooth glide toward New York, but inside Richard Langston, a storm still raged. His mask had cracked in the turbulence, but now it shattered completely under the weight of truth. He had insulted a man who embodied everything he pretended to be. Strong, successful, respected. And worse still, he had mocked someone who had given more to strangers than Richard had ever considered giving. The regret began to fester, crawling through every part of him, until it became unbearable. Soon, he would have no choice but to confront it. The question was, when he finally spoke, would Keanu accept his apology? Or would his silence, that impenetrable wall of patience, be his only answer? The cabin, still buzzing from the adrenaline of the storm, shifted into an almost reverent silence as the flight attendants whispered quietly among themselves. Keanu Reeves, calm and steady, returned to his seat after ensuring everyone around him was okay. His jacket, damp from lending it to a shivering child, hung loosely over the armrest. Across the aisle, the arrogant man who had mocked him earlier sat stiff, his face pale, his bravado gone. His hands trembled slightly as he clutched a glass of water, trying to steady his nerves. The storm outside had passed, but inside, a different kind of storm brewed, one of shame and realization. Passengers were whispering now, some sneaking glances at Keanu with newfound admiration, while others shook their heads at the man who had insulted him. The memory of Keanu kneeling to comfort the crying child and volunteering to stay calm in the middle of chaos was fresh in everyone's mind. The man's insults, his mocking laughter about a washed-up actor and Hollywood garbage, suddenly felt like daggers he had foolishly thrown at someone infinitely bigger than him, not in fame but in humanity. His words now echoed back to him like a cruel joke, and the weight of regret pressed down hard. The flight attendant, still visibly shaken, leaned toward Keanu. "Mr. Reeves, thank you for everything. You kept us calm. I don't know what would have happened if you weren't here." Keanu simply smiled, a tired, humble smile. "We all got through it together. That's what matters." The man across the aisle swallowed hard, his pride collapsing under the crushing truth. His voice cracked when he finally spoke. I'm sorry." The words hung in the air, soft yet heavy. The other passengers turned to look at him, curious if he truly meant it. The man fidgeted, unable to meet Keanu's eyes. "I didn't know who you were. I didn't know what kind of person you are." He hesitated, his arrogance evaporated into raw embarrassment. "I shouldn't have said any of those things." Keanu looked at him with that same calm, almost fatherly expression he wore throughout the ordeal. He didn't gloat, didn't smirk, didn't use this moment to get even. Instead, he simply nodded. "It's okay. Sometimes we speak before we think." His tone was soft, forgiving, but it carried a weight that cut deeper than anger ever could. The man's regret doubled, not because Keanu scolded him, but because he hadn't. The flight descended smoothly now, the turbulence behind them. Yet inside the man's chest, turbulence still raged. Every glance from the passengers reminded him of his own ugliness, how small he had looked against the quiet dignity of Keanu Reeves. He had spent the first half of the flight puffing himself up, desperate to seem important. But in the end, true importance was revealed not in wealth, status, or ego, but in kindness, humility, and courage. As the plane touched down, a quiet applause broke out, relief for a safe landing, but also unspoken gratitude toward the man in black who had shown them what real strength looked like. Keanu nodded to the flight attendants, grabbed his modest carry-on bag, and gave a small smile to those who whispered, "Thank you," as he passed. No entourage, no demand for recognition. Just a man moving through the world quietly, leaving it a little better than he found it. The arrogant man, now trembling with shame, could only watch him go. His chest ached with a truth he would carry forever. He had mocked greatness disguised in humility, and for the rest of his life he would replay that flight, that storm, that moment of regret when he realized the man he belittled wasn't just a Hollywood star. He was a rare soul whose character soared higher than any first-class seat ever could. And as Keanu Reeves disappeared into the terminal crowd, the man whispered to himself, the words heavy with remorse, "I'll never forget this."